Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be venturing into houses where the dead are still restless. So grab your flashlight and get comfortable, because it's time to let the darkness take control. When I was a kid, I had an imaginary friend. I say imaginary friend, but I'm not quite sure he was just that. You'll realise why as the story progresses. Anyway, I don't remember anything about my imaginary friend, who was apparently a huge part of my life. But anyway, we lived in this old house in Guildford, Western Australia, which is one of the oldest towns here. Our house backs onto a highway. I'm still on my mum's hip, and she comes home one day to unlock the door, and she hears someone run from the kitchen down the hallway into the classic scary bedroom at the end of the hall in a horror movie, and slams the door. My bedroom. So she calls Dad thinking someone's robbing the place, and he comes home from work with a baseball bat, and nothing. Everything is locked. No windows are open, and my bedroom door is closed. This happens more and more often, but she just shrugs it off to a spirit or whatever. It's not hurting anyone. One day, I'm playing out in the back, and she hears a knock at the door. She opens it, and I'm standing there with an elderly man, who explains he found me walking along the highway, and I directed him home. So my mum asks me how I got on the highway, and how I even know how to get home from there. I show her, besides the bushes, the small hole in the back wooden fence that you can climb through, and told her me and Felmed, my imaginary friend, went for an adventure. So this is where shit gets even weirder. Fast forward 20 years. I'm at Christmas with my dad's side of the family that grew up in the house before us, and I'm talking to my uncle about the place, and about how I kind of remember the layout and what it looked like and stuff. And he says, I was such a shit when I was younger. I found this hole in the back of the fence one day, and I got picked up on the highway and brought home by someone, and your nan lost it at me. I think this is really weird. What a coincidence. So we talk, and he tells me that he had an imaginary friend when he was younger too. You'll never guess what his name was. This happened to me around 16 years old. Every time I recount this story, I get goosebumps. Just so you're aware, we're not the type of family that believes in ghosts, or gets scared easy. Since I was a kid, I've always been that one guy in the movies that walks towards the danger instead of running from it. Anyway, my bedroom faces our backyard. We had a pretty big backyard, and we always had cats running around, making noises all throughout the night, and I was used to all sorts of random sounds. One night, at around 9 p.m, I start hearing this voice. You couldn't really understand what it was saying, but you could tell that it was muffled. The sound of the voice was the creepiest thing I had ever heard. It was something out of a horror movie. It was a very deep, demonic sounding voice, and eventually, its sound was getting closer and clearer. I still couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded like it was coming from inside my bedroom. I am terrified, but at the same time curious, and after about 10 minutes, the voice stopped. I gathered the courage to go outside and went to the kitchen to grab a knife and looked all around the backyard. We had about 40 rose bushes and fruit trees everywhere, enough for whoever to be pulling this prank on me to hide. I went to every single bush I could and found nothing. So I went back to bed and at around 2 or 3 a.m., the damn voice returns. And this time, it was so loud and clear, and sounded like it was right next to me, standing over me as I slept. I was so terrified, and turned around at this point, and I'm screaming. Just as I'm turning around, this thing made this deep growling sound. As if it was mad, I was turning, and it was growling and angry. I turn around, and there's nothing in my room. The voice is clearly coming from inside my room though, and I am frozen in fear. And this thing is walking around me, speaking to me. Somehow, I knew it was angry, and it didn't want me to move. Eventually, I got out of bed, and this thing was furious. It yelled at me, and I thought I was going to die. I fell to my knees and scampered to the corner of the room, looking out to an empty room, feeling this thing pace around my room. I didn't know for how long I was in the corner, but it felt like hours, and every single time I moved an inch, it growled and made the most weird satanic-like sounds. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to pick myself up and run to the other side of the house and wake my mother and my mum's husband up. I burst into their room crying and screaming, and I think I broke their bedroom door. They thought someone had broken in because of how hysterical I was, and my mum tried to calm me down, telling 16-year-old me that there's no such thing as ghosts and that I probably had a nightmare. There was no use calming me down. I knew what I heard, and I didn't think I was crazy, and I begged for them to go check my room out. My mum is annoyed by me, and she said she'd sleep in my room with me if that would help. She comes to my room, closes the door, and the second the door closes, that growl/rumble lets out a deep growl again and begins screaming. We were both knocked on the ground, screaming at the top of our lungs, while this invisible thing, whatever it was, made the creepiest demonic sounds I've ever heard in my life. My mother felt it also. That sound was so damn loud, my mum's husband heard it on the other side of the house. He came running into the room, opened the door, and literally dragged us both out of that room and into the living room. He's like, "What the hell was that?" At this point, my brother heard it too, and now my brother and my mum's husband are in my room, armed with a baseball bat and a knife, thinking they were going to find someone messing with us. The second they entered the room, the sound stopped, and the room was empty, as always. I have never been a person to believe in the spiritual or supernatural, and I was never scared of the dark, nor believed in superstition. I'm a skeptic, and normally try to be as logical as possible, but this is the only thing in my life that I have never found an explanation to. It scared me and scarred me well into my 20s. If my mum hadn't have entered the room and heard the voices also, and later my brother and mother's husband, I maybe could have brushed it off as my mind playing some awful tricks on me. But when my mother fell to the ground and heard the exact same thing, and sent everyone in my house running to drag us out the room, that's when I was convinced that whatever the hell this was real. This incident shook down our belief system to such an extent that my mum had a priest bless our home, and some Puerto Rican lady perform some weird rituals in my bedroom to shoo away whatever it was. When I was 17, I moved out of my parents' home due to my head being seriously messed up by a very serious traumatic event. My parents thought it was a terrible idea and tried to force me to stay with them, but I refused to listen to reason. I got a little 2-bed terraced house that I shared with my best friend when she came home from work from a holiday camp. On the day we moved in, we got a cat. The cat came with the house. It just decided to live with us. The cat would go crazy, hissing and spitting at nothing. We just thought the cat was weird. That is until things started happening. For example, gas rings would turn on by themselves in front of you. The hi-fi downstairs would turn on by itself. The bath would start filling with water when nobody was home, and we'd come home to find the bathroom flooded. However, the creepiest thing to happen was this. I was home alone. The doors were locked. The windows were closed and locked. I had the radio on in my bedroom while I was running a bath. And as I walked into the bathroom, I heard a little girl's voice say as clear as anything, "Be careful, the water's dangerous." At that precise moment, the tap, or faucet in America, started to really gush, where usually it was just a slow trickle. I mean, it would usually take 40 minutes for the bath to fill up, and that was very slow. I leave the bathroom to see if my friend had returned home, and there's no sign of her. I go to my room and turn off the radio. As I go to the door, it turns back on, but it's now just static. I turn it off again, and once more it turns back on, but the volume is up to the full. I decide to just unplug the radio and it stays off, and I go back to the bathroom, which is right next to my bedroom. On the floor is the light fitting from the ceiling. I should point out that the floor is bare concrete and that the light fitting was just a longish wire with a light bulb. The wire had been sliced through the middle, the bulb with the wire still attached, and was laying on the concrete floor, intact. It absolutely should have shattered, as the ceilings were really high, like 20 feet high. The tap turns on full blast again, and then the hi-fi downstairs turns on at full volume, playing, and I wish I were kidding, Drowning by the Backstreet Boys. I turn the tap off and pull the plug. I go to my room and yelp. The radio is still unplugged, but my previously tidy bed now has crumpled up sheets and the pillows have been moved. I ran downstairs to find my boyfriend, who is concerned because he thinks I'm having a mental breakdown due to the previous traumatic event. He soon realizes that I'm not, and tells me he'll come straight over, and I go and wait in the living room. Then I hear giggling, like two children giggling. The next thing I know, there's a bang in the kitchen. Scared out of my mind and shaking from head to toe, I go to the kitchen to discover that the gas rings are all unlit, but spewing out gas, and the cat is stood, back arched, hair sticking up, tail all bushy, hissing at the wall next to the cooker. I decide to wait outside for my boyfriend. As I'm walking down the hall to the front door, I hear more giggling, and then my hair is pulled hard, and it caused me to stumble backwards. The cat and I left that day, and stayed at my boyfriend's house during the 2 days it took to pack up and get the hell out of there. I later realized that the house was literally next door neighbors with a church. Not a normal church, oh no. It was a 3-terraced house converted into a spiritualist church. My boyfriend told his mum about what happened in that weird house, and she, having lived in that small town all her life, along with 8 previous generations, informed me that in the 1970s, 2 little girls were drowned in that bath by their mentally ill father. The father then hung himself using the bathroom light fitting. The house and church have since been demolished. I should have listened to my parents and stayed living at their house. I lived in a house built in the 1890s for a few years when I was a kid. It was either an incredibly large house or a small mansion. The man who built the house, his wife died in childbirth, giving birth to their daughter. My parents got the house on the cheap because it was in a trashy neighborhood and had been used as a meth lab at one point in between owners. Although I didn't know that until I was much older. Anyhow, a few things happened in that house that were just weird. That night, I would hear scratching in the walls. Could it have been mice? I suppose. I certainly didn't rule it out. But my father did completely renovate the 2 living rooms. That included tearing up the floor and walls, and we never found any mice or pests of any kind. My 2 brothers shared a room. I had my own since I was the eldest. In both of our bathrooms, we had this sort of built-in towel cabinet. In my brother's bathroom, the towel cabinet, its drawer, and the sink cabinets would be wide open most mornings. My mother claims that one night I came downstairs late at night while she was watching TV and said I couldn't sleep, and she told me to go to bed. She yelled at me actually, and we had a racquetball sitting in the middle of the floor in the TV room. My mother said about 45 minutes after yelling at me, the ball flung itself from its place on the ground and nearly missed hitting her in the head. She says she went upstairs thinking it was me, but that I was sound asleep. She says she thinks it was the ghost of the woman who died there in childbirth, that she was angry at my mother for not being more nurturing or patient. The layout of the house was very strange too. We had a front door, a side door, and 2 back doors to the house, all of which led outside. My parents' closet was very maze-like, way more closet space than our entire family combined could possibly need, and the closets gave way to a staircase. Directly in front of the staircase was a door leading to our backyard, and perpendicular was a storage closet. My parents would always hide our Christmas and birthday presents in this storage closet, so we would go sneaking around in there that time of the year. Well, any time we would take the stairs in the back to the 2nd floor, we would hear a thud on the door leading outside. This would cause us to run up the stairs and shut the door behind us. As we shut the door behind us, we would hear footsteps running up the stairs and a loud thud on the door you could feel. We would always brace ourselves against the door, expecting someone or something to come out, but it never went beyond that thud. That house scared the hell out of me for the 3 years that we lived there. For a few months, I lived in a government-provided house while working for the Park Service on land that almost certainly used to be a plantation. My housemates told me stories of their blinds flying up in the middle of the night, loud, unexplained noises, but I brushed it off as their imagination until it started happening to me. Doors would open by themselves. I would hear people coming into the house, and when I checked, there was no one there. My garbage can lid opened itself right before my eyes. There were several other witnesses, and my friend heard people talking outside her window when there was no one there. I blamed these on wind. The creepiest things were that my friend in law enforcement came home from an evening shift to see his window partially open with handprints on the window, as if someone was trying to get in. We all lived in a pretty remote area, with the houses right next to each other, and would have definitely noticed unfamiliar headlights. The windows were only cracked a bit, even though it would have been easy to open and get in all the way, which made it even weirder. The strangest thing though was that everyone in the park housing was watching a movie at my house. No one had left the house for the entire time, and at the end of the night, I looked outside and my deck chairs had been taking 50 feet off the deck and moved into a circle around a big tree in my yard. No one heard anything, saw anyone moving them through the windows, or had any explanation. None of us slept well the rest of the time we were there. My wife and I were dating and decided to move in together. We were excited to get our own apartment in South Florida and rented a suburban townhouse with our 2 dogs. Things were awesome at first. The place was sunny and breezy, with a fenced yard, and for the first part of the year, the doors and windows were always almost open. Summer started rolling in, with hot, heavy days and thunderstorms. We had to retreat inside the comfort of the AC, and things started to go south. We could feel it. The house started to feel oppressive. We started talking to each other less. Most of our conversations were single-word exchanges. We weren't mad exactly. We just both felt exhausted as soon as we would walk through the door. Then the dogs stopped going upstairs. Until this point, they'd slept in our room without issue. One day, they just refused. There hadn't been any event or trauma. They both flatly would not go upstairs. Shortly after that point, I was doing something upstairs and noticed the door frame to the bedroom was nailed together with finishing nails, as in it had previously been shattered and the pieces were nailed back together. I looked at the guest room and found the same thing. Both doors had been kicked in from the hallway at some point and put back together. From here, things got angry. The wife and I went from sort of smothered in a wet blanket to actively fighting all the time. Over nothing. We were still sleeping upstairs, and the dogs downstairs, but neither of us were sleeping well. This was also a new development. We both began to wake up in the night, sometimes at the same time as each other, but frequently one at a time, and never for any specific reason. Neither of us would want to get out of bed, and the result was still a lot of muffled nights of uneasy feelings, which started to bleed into the day. The anger continued, but now with dread of nightfall. With the sun down, there was a constant feeling of being watched, or of something in the back of your mind that you know is horrible, but can't quite put your finger on it. So instead, you just have a pit in your stomach. When we would leave the house, we'd feel better, but coming home was always bad. We tried to find excuses to stay somewhere else as much as possible, but that was tough with the dogs. Several times we had weekends out that were wonderful and cheerful, only to return to the townhouse and immediately start fighting. Still, over nothing. The fighting started to get violent, not with each other but with the house. Dishes were broken on the floor, glasses thrown against walls, doors slammed hard enough to knock pictures free from frames. It was from both sides. Both of us were the aggressors. It was bananas. I woke up one night to find a young African-American boy in the bed. He was probably 6 or 7, dressed in jeans and a red shirt. And when I sat up, he also sat up, and then he vanished. At this point, neither the wife or I were sleeping much, so I chalked it up to that. However, it was the impetus to sit down and talk about whatever was happening to us. It was the first time either of us acknowledged that something may be up with the townhouse. We agreed to try sleeping downstairs that night, and both managed to get a bit more sleep. The sense of dread was still there, but less on the floor of the living room. It may have just been that the doors were in sight, so an easy exit was possible. I honestly don't know. We stayed on the floor of the living room for a few nights, on an inflatable bed, and then tried moving back upstairs. We both lasted about 45 minutes before we agreed that something was up. We moved the actual mattress downstairs and started looking for a new apartment. But we still had 6 months on the lease and no money in the bank. It took us 2 months to find a new place, at which point the old house was so unbearable, we moved in immediately and paid double rent, maxing out the credit cards. It is so hard to explain the foregoing without sounding campy or melodramatic. A lot of creepy stories of haunted houses revolve around perception of events, seeing something, hearing noises, funny smells. This was something that was so quiet and creeping, and built so slowly that I'm still not sure what happened, other than there was an actual emotional effect from being in the house, and it was terrible. After moving out, we did get a call from the people who moved in after us. They got our number from the neighbour and asked some vague questions about the house, and we were pretty candid that we did not like the vibes, but sort of left it at that. A few months later, we heard from the same neighbour that the new tenants had also moved out, with no notice, and the landlord was looking for them. I was pet sitting for a client that goes to the vet clinic I worked at. I was to stay overnight and basically just live there while they were gone. No big deal. I pet sit on a regular basis. This was the first time I stayed at their house, and it was a very big and definitely nice house. The owner was a surgeon, and the day went by fine, and then night came. I was told to sleep upstairs with the lab. When it was time for bed, she did not want to go upstairs. She had her tail in between her legs and was whining. This had made me a little nervous, since she normally sleep upstairs with the owners. After 5 minutes of trying, I finally get her up. I went to the bedroom and climbed in bed. Obviously, it's common for houses to creak and whatnot at night, so when pet sitting, I always look to the dogs to see if they're nervous, if it's a normal house noise or not, and to see if they're disturbed. She isn't. Lights go out, and the dog after was pacing like crazy. And then the shadows appeared under the door, constantly moving, and definitely not the dog's or mine. They didn't have any other pets, so this worried me, but I dismissed it. Then it sounded like a moving team was working in the room next to mine. It literally sounded like the entire room was being rearranged. Dressers dragging across the floor and slamming into the walls, causing them to shake, and lots of dragging and screeching noises. I never had the nerve to open the door to this room, so I'm not positive what was making the noise. Now the dog started whining, cowering, and wouldn't stop looking from me to the door. At this point I'm now scared, and contemplating making a mad dash downstairs. I built up the courage to open my bedroom door after 20 minutes of constant dragging, crashing and screeching, and dashed down the stairs, dog at my feet. All the noises I heard stopped, and the whole house is quiet. I got to the outside door, which was a pain because it sticks and was hard to open. Then to close it, you have to slam it shut or it doesn't latch. I opened it and got outside with the dog. I turned around to slam the door shut, and before I reached the handle, the door slams in my face. The next morning, I returned with the dog to feed her breakfast. I went in through the attached garage, and all is fine in the house. While the dog was eating, I decided to go outside and get the mail. I returned to the garage door, which was locked, and I had left it unlocked. I had the front door key in my car and could enter. Needless to say, I didn't stay there again. My father owned a house in Florida for a while. I was a poor young adult, just out of college at the time, and I couldn't afford to go down there usually. But we made a deal that I would fly down on his dime if I cleaned the house thoroughly after the winter renters left. The plan was to stay for a week. My sister was coming for a couple of days after I arrived, and left before I did. So I had a couple of days on my own in the house before she arrived, and one night alone after she left. When I arrived, I decided to start cleaning in the back, master bedroom, and work my way towards the front of the house. 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. Master bedroom was down a long hallway removed from the rest of the house. I walk into the bedroom, and there was blood on the pillows and down the side of the bed. It looked like someone had had a very bad nosebleed. But my first thought was that there was a lot of blood. It was gross, but I wasn't scared. I was just like, great, how am I going to clean that up? So I went into the master bath and started scrubbing the floors, hands and knees. All of a sudden, I get completely overwhelmed with the sense of something big and evil lurking behind me in the door. I don't know how to describe it, except that it was just this sense of absolute dread and panic. I dropped what I was doing and left the room. It took me a while to calm down and not feel frightened, but after a couple of hours, I did. From a practical perspective, I figured I would try and clean it again when my sister arrived, for moral support, and camped out in the guest room for my stay. I did not go back into that room until after she arrived. When she gets there, I told her that I couldn't stay back there, and I told her what happened. I did not mention the blood. At that point, it for me was more about that horrible feeling of a presence. I told her if she wanted to stay there she could, or she could take the guest room and I'll take the couch. No way I was staying back there. So she says that she will. So I walk back there with her, open the door, look at the bed. No blood. I didn't feel that presence again after that point, and I leave her to unpack. 15 minutes after, she comes back out. I can't stay in there, she says. We just exchanged a look that says we both get it. And she stayed in the guest room, and I stayed in the couch. She helped me clean that back room, although we did not do a very good job. Just cursory to get out ASAP. Other little things happened during the week, but we were out enjoying the area, so nothing too memorable. Then she leaves, and I'm alone for the night. My flight was at like noon the next day or something, but I had never packed and was ready to leave so fast, and wasn't planning on spending any more time there than necessary. I had the TV on to try and not freak out, and kept seeing out of the corner of my eye what I think were little human creatures darting across the ground. But I'm tired and tried to write it off as just that. When I turn to look, they're not there. I'm freaking out, but I focus on the TV and finally start to doze off when the TV suddenly turns to static and the volume shoots super loud. I jump about a mile and try to turn the TV off with the remote. It won't. I get up and try to turn it off with the TV. It won't. I unplug it from the wall. It won't turn off. That was it. I grabbed my bag and left. I went to the airport even though it was like 3 a.m. and waited there for my flight. Never went back. My sister also refused to return, and my father ended up selling the place because neither of us wanted to go. So my grandparents and I moved into a house when I was about 4 or 5, and had lived here since. In the basement, in one of the walls, there's what can only be described as a window, about 5 feet off the ground. A hole in the wall about the size of a basement window would be. We decided to see what was on the other side, since it was all boarded up. Nothing, just a room that's about 8 by 8, empty and dusty. That night, everything started. Laying in bed for the first few years, almost every night, I would hear footsteps in the attic. Sometimes 2 sets. My grandparents told me they'd seen a little girl around my age at the time, wearing a white dress and having long blonde hair, run from my room across the hall into the middle of the night, several times, only to disappear into our next room. They've also seen her peek her head around corners from the staircase into the living room while they've been watching TV at night. Being grandparents, they get up to pee in the middle of the night a lot. A couple of times, my grandparents saw a shadowy figure the size of a large man walking down the hall at him. One time, it bumped into him and kept going. He thought it was my uncle who was living with us, but he turned on the light and it was gone. They also made reports about seeing it being chased by the previous mentioned girl away from my room a couple of times while I was sleeping. They called the girl my guardian angel, and after a while of this, my grandpa got fed up, yelled that this was his house and to get out. They boarded the room in the basement back up, and we haven't heard any footsteps or creepy things for about 10 years now. Another time, when I was about 14 or 15, I was up playing video games, and out of the corner of my eye, since I was sitting next to a window, I see a blue ball of light shoot by and fly down the street. It sounded like the crackle static electricity makes. At the very moment that happens, I heard my grandpa yell from the next room over. Apparently, he had woken up unable to move with his comforter completely covered by what looked like static, crackling above him. He felt a sharp pain in his back and was able to move again as it lifted off the bed and shot out the window. And that's when I saw it. The house I grew up in, without a doubt, was haunted. It was built by a very prominent New Orleans architect after his son was killed by a streetcar on St. Charles Avenue one foggy morning. He built the house to get away from the guilt he felt in what was then a suburb of the city, and he definitely still haunts the place. Growing up there were some very weird things that happened, specifically in my bedroom, which turns out was where the architect later killed himself. There are 2 instances that come to mind that are kind of typical of what happened. The first is in the front yard. I was playing soccer with my brothers and some friends from the neighborhood, and the ball rolled under the porch. No big deal. I crawled under the house to retrieve it, which I had done 1,000 times before, as a gap under the house wasn't covered. When I came out, I remember looking up towards my room on the 2nd story of the house, and I saw a very well-dressed elderly man looking directly at me. He put his fingers up to his lips and mouthed, "Shush." You bet I shut right the hell up. I sprinted right back to where we had set up the goalposts and never told anyone this story. I'm sure I looked absolutely terrified, but we kept playing the game. The other incident happened in the room itself. The room had a main area where I had my bed and couch, and there was a hallway with closets on the side and a bathroom. Early one Saturday morning, my brother and I were cleaning the bathroom, I don't know why, before we went to summer camp, and the door was closed. The door started rattling on the hook that it was locked with, and we both distinctly heard a raspy voice whisper, "Get out," very clearly. I guess the ghost had to use the bathroom or something, or we were disrupting his Saturday morning ritual. We both got right out of there and sprinted right down the stairs to tell our mother, who said it must have been our brother, and I slept in the living room for the next 2 weeks. Little things like that happened the whole time we lived there, but eventually we got used to it. I don't think the ghost was malicious because nothing serious happened. We were around the same age as his son when he died, when the activity reached its peak, which is honestly really scary and sad to look back on. I'm not really the type to believe in ghosts, but this house convinced me.